I used to believe that if you gave enough love, people would eventually give it back. For 40 years I cooked, cleaned, fixed problems, and swallowed words just to keep my family together. They called me the family rock. Funny thing about rocks, people lean on them, but they never ask how much weight they can hold. When my husband passed, I thought my children would rally around me. Instead, they started fighting over what he left behind: the house, the savings, the land. I became invisible in my own home. The same hands I once fed were now pointing fingers. I didn't yell, I didn't fight, but I did one thing no one expected. I stopped being their rock. And when I finally walked away, that's when the cracks began to show. I always thought my life would quiet down after 60. You know, a slower kind of rhythm, mornings with tea on the porch, watching the sunlight stretch across the magnolia trees, maybe a visit from one of the kids every other weekend. But somehow, even after all those years, I was still the one holding everything together. Still the one everyone called when something went wrong. I used to laugh when my neighbors called me the family rock. They said it like a compliment, and for a while I believed it was. Rocks are strong, steady, dependable, but no one ever tells you that being the rock means you're also the one everyone leans on, stands on, and forgets to thank. I wore that name like a badge of honor, though. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of falling apart. Our house in Savannah wasn't much. A single-story brick home with a white swing on the porch that creaked in the wind. Henry built that swing himself back when the kids were small. He had hands that could fix anything, and a heart that could forgive even more. He was the gentle half of us. When he got sick, everything changed. It started with small things. A stumble here, a word lost there. Then the doctor said, stroke. The time just stopped. Henry couldn't talk much after that. He'd look at me with those soft brown eyes, trying to tell me something, but all that came out were fragments of sounds. That's when I learned what real silence feels like, the kind that fills a house and echoes even after you fall asleep. I had 3 kids to feed and a husband to take care of. There wasn't time to feel sorry for myself. I took every nursing shift I could find, sometimes working through the night, then coming home before sunrise to make breakfast, and gets the kids off to school. I watched their little faces light up over pancakes and syrup, pretending I wasn't dead tired. The truth is, exhaustion became part of me. It was like an old coat I couldn't take off. Lisa, my oldest, was the responsible one, or at least she liked to think she was. Always bossing her brothers around, always telling me how I should handle things. She had her father's sharp mind, but not his soft heart. Then there was Paul, the middle child, always chasing attention. He'd make jokes at the dinner table, just to see us laugh. And Eric, my baby, quiet, thoughtful, and always close to me. He used to slip little notes into my lunch bag when I worked nights. "Love you, Mom," written in his messy handwriting. Those tiny notes kept me going when nothing else did. Sometimes I think back on those years and wonder how I did it. How I worked those double shifts, cleaned the house, paid the bills, took care of Henry, and still made it to church every Sunday. Maybe I was running on something other than strength. Maybe it was love, or maybe it was the fear of what would happen if I ever stopped moving. There were nights I'd come home, step quietly into our bedroom, and see Henry sleeping, his chest rising slow, his hand resting on the blanket. I'd sit beside him, brush the hair from his forehead, and whisper about my day like he could still answer me. Sometimes I'd imagine him saying, "Maggie, you're doing too much." But even if he could have spoken, I don't think I would have listened. Back then I thought taking care of everyone was my purpose, my whole identity. The kids grew up faster than I expected. One day I was packing lunches, the next I was waving from the porch as they drove off to college. The house got quieter with each goodbye. I thought that maybe once they had their own lives, I could finally rest. But that's not how it went. When Henry's condition got worse, I had to quit the hospital and take care of him full-time. The insurance covered some, but not enough. Bills stacked up like bad memories. Lisa came by once a week back then, usually with a list of suggestions. She'd talk about selling the house, downsizing, maybe moving Henry into assisted living. I knew she meant well, but there was something cold in her tone, like practicality had replaced compassion. Paul would stop in when he needed money, or when his marriage was falling apart. Eric... Well, he called often, but his job kept him away. Out of all of them, he was the only one who seemed to understand that sometimes I didn't need help. I just needed someone to listen. Henry passed on a Thursday morning. I remember because the magnolia tree outside was blooming, and the air smelled like honey and rain. He went quietly, holding my hand. There was no big moment, no grand speech, just a soft exhale, and then stillness. I thought I'd fall apart, but instead I felt numb. Like I'd been rehearsing for that silence all along. The kids came back home for the funeral, each of them grieving in their own way. Lisa was efficient, handling the paperwork. Paul made it about him, loud, dramatic, always needing comfort. And Eric, he stayed close to me, helping with the little things. I tried to stay strong for them. That's what rocks do. They hold. They don't crumble even when they're cracking inside. After Henry's death, I told myself I'd take a break, maybe rest, maybe travel a bit. But that never happened. The calls started almost immediately. Lisa needing advice, Paul needing money, Eric needing reassurance that the family wouldn't fall apart. I tried to be there every time. I told myself that's what Henry would have wanted. But the truth is, I was tired. Not just the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that sits in your bones and makes you feel invisible. Every favor I did, every time I said yes, when I wanted to say no, it chipped away at me a little more. I'd look at my reflection sometimes and barely recognize the woman staring back. Her hair was thinner, her eyes duller, her smile forced. I kept thinking, when did I stop being me? The house, once full of laughter, started feeling like a waiting room. Just me and the ticking clock. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset stretch across the yard, and I'd wonder if Henry would even recognize the life we'd built. It used to be filled with love and noise and purpose. Now it was just quiet and not the peaceful kind. I still cooked Sunday dinners, hoping the kids would visit. Sometimes they did. Most times they didn't. Lisa always had work. Paul had excuses. And Eric, well, he meant to come, but life got busy. I'd make too much food anyway, just in case. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, sweet tea, all the favorites. And then I'd pack it all away in Tupperware and tell myself I'd eat it later. There was one night I remember clear as day. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at 3 untouched plates. The candles had burned low, wax dripping like tears onto the tablecloth. I laughed, a quiet, broken laugh, and said out loud, "Guess it's just you and me, Henry." The house creaked in response, like it understood. People talk about empty nest syndrome, like it's something that happens once the kids leave. But it's not the leaving that hurts. It's realizing they never really look back, that the person who gave them everything becomes a footnote in their busy lives. I used to tell myself it was just the way things go, that I shouldn't expect gratitude. But deep down, I wanted something, not a gift, not even a thank you, just a little kindness, just to be seen. Every time one of them called me Mom, it felt both warm and heavy, because it wasn't a name, it was a job title, and I'd been doing that job my whole life without ever getting a day off. I think I started to realize it around that time, that I'd spent so many years keeping everyone else from falling apart. I never noticed how much of myself I'd lost in the process. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the crickets, and wonder how much longer I could keep being the rock. The truth was, I didn't know who I was without that role, but part of me was beginning to wonder what would happen if I stopped carrying everyone. If I just put it all down for once. And that's where it began. The first quiet thought that maybe, just maybe, I didn't owe them my whole life anymore. It was small, almost a whisper, but once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of everything that came next. The beginning of me learning that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is finally let go. It's funny how love can change shape without you even noticing. One day it's soft, warm, and easy, like sunlight through a kitchen window. Then before you realize it, that same love starts to feel heavy, like a coat you forgot to take off after coming inside. You keep wearing it because it's what you've always done, but after a while you start to wonder if it's love you're carrying, or just habit. After Henry passed, I told myself I'd stay strong for the kids. They'd lost their father. I couldn't let them lose their mother too. I thought if I stayed steady, kept the Sunday dinners, remembered birthdays, called to check on them, that would keep us close. But over time, it wasn't closeness I felt anymore. It was responsibility. Lisa was the first to change. My oldest, my planner. She'd always been the one who needed to be in control. At first I appreciated her help, handling the bills, making sure I kept my doctor appointments, calling to check in. But it didn't take long before those calls started to sound less like love and more like management. "Mom, you can't keep spending money on little things," she'd say, scrolling through my checkbook like she was auditing a company. "You don't need to buy groceries for Paul when he visits. He's a grown man. I just nod, smile, and say, "All right, honey," even though inside it's dumb. It wasn't about the groceries. It was about wanting to feed my son, to keep some part of my family life alive. But Lisa made me feel like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own choices. Then there was Paul, my middle one, always restless, always chasing something that never quite worked out. He'd come by every few weeks, sometimes with a new girlfriend, sometimes alone, sometimes looking like he hadn't slept in days. He'd sit at the kitchen table, same spot as when he was little, and tell me stories, big dreams, new ventures, plans that never made it past words. But there was always an ask at the end. "Mom, just a loan, till next month. Mom, I'll pay you back when the deal comes through." And I'd always say yes. Every time he left, I'd tell myself he was just going through a rough patch. That's what mothers do. We believe our children's promises long after they stop making sense. But the truth was, Paul didn't need my money. He needed my approval, and I gave it freely because it was the only way I knew to keep him close. Eric, my youngest, tried to stay neutral. He was the quiet observer, the one who listened more than he spoke. He'd come by, fix things around the house, the leaky faucet, the loose step on the porch, and I'd make him tea while he worked. He had his father's calm, but even with Eric, there was distance creeping in. He'd talk about work, about his friends, about trips he wanted to take. I'd smile and nod, proud of the man he'd become, but also aware of the space growing between us. He was building a life that didn't need me in it every day. That's the bittersweet part of raising good children. You raise them to be independent, and then you realize that means they don't depend on you anymore. Still, I tried to hold everyone together. Every Sunday I'd set the table for 6, even if I knew only 2 or 3 would show. Sometimes Lisa would bring her husband, sometimes Paul would breeze in late, and sometimes Eric would call just to say work kept him busy. I'd tell them, "That's all right, sweetheart, next week," even when I knew next week wouldn't be any different. When they did come, it wasn't the same anymore. Lisa would spend half the meal checking her phone, whispering to her husband about work. Paul would argue with her about politics or money, his voice always rising a little too fast. Eric would sit quiet, watching, trying to keep the peace. And me? I'd smile through it, refill glasses, pass the mashed potatoes, and pray for a moment of laughter that didn't feel forced. I remember one Sunday in particular, the tension had been building for weeks. Little comments, side glances, sighs. It was summer, hot and sticky, and I'd been in the kitchen since morning, baking Henry's favorite peach cobbler because it always used to bring everyone to the table. Lisa walked in, fanning herself with a napkin. "Mom, why do you insist on cooking all this? You should rest. We could have just ordered something." I smiled and said, "Cooking keeps me busy. Besides, y'all like it." Paul laughed, pouring himself a glass of sweet tea. "Lisa doesn't like anything unless it comes in a takeout box with her name spelled right." Lisa shot him a glare. "At least I can pay for mine, Paul," and just like that, it began. Voices rising, accusations flying, 2 grown adults turning my kitchen into a battlefield. I stood there, wooden spoon in hand, watching my children tear into each other like strangers. "Enough," I said quietly, but they didn't hear me. "Enough," I said again, louder this time, still nothing. Finally I slammed the spoon down on the counter. The sound echoed through the kitchen. They both froze. "This house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "used to be filled with laughter. Your father built these walls with love, and I won't have them filled with hate." Lisa sighed, rolling her eyes. "Mom, we're just talking." "No," I said, softer now. "You're forgetting how to talk without hurting each other." For a moment the room went quiet. Then Paul mumbled something under his breath and walked out the back door, slamming it behind him. Lisa followed soon after, saying she had things to do. I stood there alone, the smell of peaches still sweet in the air, the cobbler untouched on the counter. I sat at the table, looking at the empty chairs, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was sadness, heavy and familiar like a sigh I'd been holding in for years. That night, I washed the dishes slowly, one by one. The house was quiet again, except for the hum of the ceiling fan and the cicadas outside. I kept thinking about what Lisa said. "You should rest." She meant it as a kindness, I think. But to me it sounded like a dismissal, like my effort, my love, was a nuisance now. It's strange, the way people start to take you for granted. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small ways. Forgotten thank yous, shorter visits, tone that sounds more like impatience than love. I told myself they didn't mean it. that they were just busy. But deep down I could feel it. I wasn't the center anymore. I was a background character in their lives, someone to be checked on, managed, and occasionally visited. The irony is, I thought keeping the peace would make things better. I thought if I stayed quiet, didn't complain, didn't demand too much, they'd eventually realize what I was doing for them. But silence doesn't buy you gratitude. It just teaches people you'll accept less. Months went by like that, visits filled with arguments, calls that felt like obligations, and a growing emptiness in the house. I'd walk past Henry's old chair and imagine him sitting there, shaking his head the way he used to when the kids acted up. "They'll learn, Maggie," I can almost hear him say. "Give it time." But time wasn't healing anything. It was just stretching the distance between us. One evening, Lisa came by after work, still in her office clothes, sharp and tired. She handed me a folder and said, "Mom, you should think about downsizing. This house is too big for you now. You don't need all this space." I looked around the photographs on the walls, the memories in every corner, and said softly, "It's not just space, Lisa, it's home." She sighed, sitting across from me. "I know, but it's too much for you to manage. You could get something smaller closer to me. We'd see each other more." But I knew better. It wasn't about seeing me more. It was about control. She wanted to feel like she was helping, like she was fixing things, but really she just didn't trust me to live my life without her guidance. I smiled and said, "I'll think about it." But I didn't mean it. After she left, I sat in the quiet again, listening to the crickets outside, and felt something inside me begin to tighten. Love had turned into obligation. Every mom carried weight now, every visit felt like a chore, every conversation had edges, and through it all I kept pretending it was fine, because that's what rocks do. They hold steady, even as the waves start to wear them down. But deep inside I knew something was changing, not just in them, but in me. I was starting to wonder how much longer I could keep carrying everyone without breaking apart. And somewhere in that wondering, a small thought began to whisper again, the same one that had found me once before. Maybe love isn't about holding on. Maybe sometimes it's about learning when to let go. I remember that morning like it was carved into me. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with something I couldn't quite name. The funeral had passed, the guests had gone home, and the casseroles had stopped coming. What was left was the silence, and a strange kind of business that follows death. Lisa was the one who arranged the meeting with the lawyer. Of course she was. "It's just paperwork, Mom," she'd said over the phone, her tone brisk, like she was scheduling a dentist appointment. "We'll get everything sorted so you can focus on healing." Healing, that word felt foreign. I didn't even know what it meant anymore. The office was small and smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. There were framed certificates on the wall, the kind that tried to make you feel like you were in good hands. I sat in the leather chair across from the desk, holding my purse tightly in my lap. Lisa sat to my left, polished and proper as always, scrolling through her phone until the lawyer walked in. Paul slouched in the chair beside her, tapping his foot like he couldn't wait to leave. Eric sat quietly near the window, watching the sunlight catch the dust in the air. The lawyer, a man named Thomas Green, smiled politely as he opened a folder. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know this is a difficult time, and I want to express my condolences for your loss." His words felt rehearsed. I nodded anyway, because that's what you do in rooms like that. He started reading the will. It was Henry's voice in someone else's mouth. A list of wishes and signatures that turned a lifetime into legal language. Most of it was simple. Debts to be settled, personal belongings distributed, small donations to the church and the local clinic. Then came the part about the house, my house. Regarding the property located at 314 Magnolia Lane, the lawyer said, clearing his throat, Mr. Hill specified joint ownership among his 3 children, Lisa, Paul, and Eric Hill. Any decisions regarding sale, maintenance, or transfer must be agreed upon by all parties. I blinked. For a second I thought I'd misheard. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "Could you repeat that?" He did, word for word. I sat there, staring at the papers on his desk. Henry's name was right there, in black ink, next to that decision. I could almost hear his voice in my head. "It'll keep them close, Maggie. They'll have to work together." But he hadn't thought about what that meant for me. Lisa spoke first, crossing her arms. "Well, that makes sense. It's the fair thing to do." "Fair?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She glanced at me, her tone patient in that condescending way she had. "Mom, you don't need to handle the house alone anymore. This way we can help you manage things. It's a lot of work keeping up a property this size." Paul leaned back in his chair, smirking. Or maybe it's time to sell, huh? That place is worth a fortune now. Magnolia Lane, developers would pay good money for it. I felt something twist in my chest. That house, I said slowly, is where I raised you. Where your father and I know, Mom, Lisa interrupted. But it's not practical. We have to think about everyone. The taxes, the maintenance. The money, Paul added with a laugh. Let's not pretend this isn't about that. Lisa shot him a glare. You'd know all about that, wouldn't you? And just like that it started. The arguing, the accusations, the same sharp voices that had filled my house for years. Only this time, it wasn't just noise. It was about me, about what was mine. Eric stayed quiet, staring down at his hands. I looked at him, hoping for something, a word, a look, anything. But he just sat there, torn between loyalty and peace. He'd always been the peacemaker, and peacemakers are the ones who end up bleeding from both sides. The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. If it helps, he said gently. Mr. Hill expressed deep trust in all of you. He wanted to ensure the property remained in the family. In the family. The words hit me like cold water. It was Henry's way of trying to hold us together even after he was gone. But he didn't see what I saw, how love had turned to convenience, how respect had turned to control. The family he was trying to protect wasn't the same family anymore. When we left the office, I walked a few steps behind the kids. They were already talking about market value, about who could handle the paperwork, about how Mom will be fine. Their voices blended with the sound of traffic and the buzz of the city, until it all just became noise. On the drive home, I stared out the window. The trees blurred by, green and gold, and I thought about the years I'd spent in that house. The nights I stayed up nursing, Henry through the pain, the laughter that once echoed down the hallway, the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet mornings with coffee and sunlight. Every inch of that house held a piece of me, and now it was shared property. When we pulled into the driveway, Lisa followed me inside. She looked around like she was already making plans, mentally rearranging the furniture, calculating costs. Mom, she started gently, I think we need to talk about the future. You can't handle this place on your own forever. I set my purse down on the counter. I've been handling it on my own for years. I know, but now things are different. Dad's gone, and... I turned to her, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't you dare say he's gone like he's just a bill that stopped being paid. He's here, Lisa. Every inch of this place is him. She looked startled, then sighed. You're being emotional. Of course I'm emotional, I said. This is my home. She shook her head. You mean our home, Mom. That's what the will says. Our home. That phrase sat between us like a knife. When she left, the house felt different. Colder somehow. I walked through each room, the kitchen, the living room, the hallway lined with family pictures. I stopped at one photo of all of us on the front porch. Henry was smiling, arm around me, the kids still small and close. Back then, the future looked simple. Love looked permanent. I sat on the couch and held that photo in my hands until the edges started to bend. Over the next few weeks, the calls started again. Lisa with her plans, Paul with his ideas, Eric trying to smooth things over. They wanted to meet with a real estate agent to just see what it's worth. They said all the right words. For your comfort, for your peace of mind, for everyone's good. But I heard the truth beneath them. It wasn't about comfort or peace. It was about control. One afternoon, Lisa stopped by unannounced. She stood at the door holding folders, looking every bit the businesswoman she'd grown into. I made some calculations, she said, setting them on the table. If we sell now, the market's great. You could take a smaller place near me. Something easy with no yard work. Paul could finally get out of debt, and Eric could invest for the future. It's the smart thing to do. I just looked at her. Her words were polished, logical, but her eyes were hard. There was no warmth there, no memory of who this house once belonged to. Lisa, I said quietly, when your father and I bought this place, we didn't pick it for its market value. We picked it because we could see a life here, a family. We didn't think about selling. We thought about staying. She sighed. You're being sentimental again. You can't live in memories forever. Maybe she was right. But what she didn't understand was that this house wasn't just a place. It was proof of a life built from nothing, of years spent holding things together when everything else was falling apart. That night, I walked through the house again. The lights were low, the floor creaked under my feet, and I could almost hear Henry's voice, gentle, steady, full of belief. "They'll be okay, Maggie. You've raised them right." But standing there in the quiet, I realized something. They weren't okay, and maybe neither was I. That was the night something inside me shifted. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just stood there, feeling the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made, and the sudden, piercing understanding that none of it mattered to them anymore. Love had become a ledger, and I was the debt they wanted to close. I went to bed with that thought, and by morning I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep being the rock they stood on while they chipped away at the very ground beneath me. Something had to change, and it would, but not in the way they expected. The morning I decided to stop fighting wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no big argument, no slammed doors or angry tears. It began the same way as every other day, the kettle whistling on the stove, sunlight slipping through the lace curtains, and that old clock in the hallway ticking like it always had. Only this time the sound didn't comfort me. It reminded me that time was still moving, even if my family had already moved past me. After the meeting with Lisa, I spent a long night sitting at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, and the papers she'd left behind, the so-called plans for my future, were spread across the table like a crime scene. Charts, sale projections, listings of smaller homes she thought I might like. It was all so neat, so efficient, so cold. I ran my hand over the papers and whispered, "You really don't know me at all, do you?" That's when it came to me, not as a burst of anger, but as something calm, steady, and clear. I'd been quiet my whole life, thinking that silence meant peace. But that night, I realized silence could mean something else entirely. It could mean power. Henry used to say, "Never show them your next move until you've already made it." He wasn't a schemer. He was just a man who understood people. And years ago, when he got sick, he made sure to protect the one thing he loved most, this house. He'd set up a trust, something he said might keep the wolves from the door if things ever got complicated. I didn't think much of it then. But now, it was starting to make sense. The next morning, I called Mr. Green, the same lawyer who'd read the will. My voice didn't shake. "Thomas," I said, "I'd like to come in. There's something I'd like to review, privately." He hesitated. "Of course, Mrs. Hill. Is this about the estate?" "Yes," I said, "but not the part everyone knows about." He didn't ask questions after that. Maybe he could hear in my tone that I wasn't in the mood to be managed. When I arrived at his office, the same fake coffee smell lingered. He closed the door behind me, and I took a seat, placing my purse on my lap. "I need to know," I said, "about the land trust Henry set up before he passed. You mentioned it once, back when he was alive." Mr. Green nodded slowly, pulling out a file. "Yes, I remember. It was part of his long-term estate planning. He placed the land itself, the property beneath the house, into a living trust, separate from the home deed. Technically speaking, you're the sole trustee and beneficiary." I looked him straight in the eye. Meaning, he said carefully, "that while your children have shared ownership of the house, the land it sits on belongs entirely to you." I sat back, letting that settle. "So," I said softly, "they can sell the house but not the ground it's on." He smiled faintly. "That's correct, Mrs. Hill. Without your consent, no sale can legally go through." I exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, I felt something lift inside me. Not joy, not even relief. It was something quieter, a kind of peace that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to save you. "I'd like to update the paperwork," I said. "Make sure it's airtight, and I don't want them knowing until I'm ready." He nodded. "Understood." That afternoon I drove home with the windows down. The air smelled like cut grass and summer rain, and I felt more awake than I had in years. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, not out of fear, but purpose. I wasn't going to beg for respect anymore. I was going to earn it back quietly, one signed paper at a time. Over the next few weeks, I played my part perfectly. I smiled when Lisa called, nodded through her plans, even pretended to take notes during our family discussions. She'd spread papers across the dining table, pointing at numbers and saying things like, "This is what's best for everyone, Mom." Paul would chime in, already spending his share before the ink was dry. "Once it's sold, we can all move forward. You can get a condo, Lisa can invest, I can finally pay off my debts." Eric would sit quietly, sipping his coffee, his eyes darting between us. I could see the guilt there. He knew this wasn't right, but he didn't know how to stop it. I sat there, pouring tea, smiling gently, nodding at all the right moments, From the outside, I must have looked like the same old Margaret, calm, agreeable, maybe even naive. But inside, I was working. Every conversation was a piece of a puzzle. Every polite smile was a wall going up between what they thought they knew and what I was really doing. One evening, I invited them all over. I told them I wanted to talk things through one last time. Lisa arrived first, crisp and efficient, already carrying her folders. Paul came next, 10 minutes late, smelling faintly of cologne and beer. Eric came last, quiet as always, offering to help in the kitchen. I made tea, set out the good cups, the china ones I only used on holidays, and laid out a tray of lemon cookies. It looked like any other family gathering, except for one thing. This time, I wasn't there to be managed. I was there to listen. Lisa started the conversation the moment she sat down. "I've spoken to a realtor who specializes in properties like yours," she said. "We could get close to 700,000, maybe more, once it's split 4 ways. 3 ways, Paul corrected. "It's not 4. Mom's already got her share of savings." Lisa glared at him. "Paul, it's not about that. It's about fairness." "Fairness?" He laughed. "You're not exactly doing this out of charity, Lisa." They were bickering before the tea even cooled. I sat there, stirring my cup slowly, the spoon clinking against the porcelain like a metronome. The rhythm kept me calm. Eric finally spoke. "Maybe we should slow down. I mean, it's still Dad's house. Maybe Mom isn't ready to—" "I'm fine," I interrupted gently. They all turned to look at me. "If you think selling is the best idea, then I won't stand in your way." Lisa's expression softened immediately. "I knew you'd understand, Mom. It's for everyone's good," Paul grinned. "Now that's the spirit." Eric looked uncertain, but he didn't argue. They talked for another hour about logistics, lawyers, and listings. I poured tea, offered cookies, and said almost nothing. When the night ended, they thanked me, as if I'd finally come around. But when they left, I went straight to my bedroom, closed the door, and let the smile fade from my face. I sat down at Henry's old desk, the one he used for paying bills and writing birthday cards, and opened the drawer. Inside was a single envelope, the trust documents Mr. Green had updated and notarized. My name in bold, Margaret Hill, sole trustee. I traced the letters with my fingertip, whispering, "You didn't just build this house for them, Henry. You built it for me." That night I slept better than I had in months. In the days that followed, I kept up the act. I started boxing up some of my things, making it look like I was preparing to move. I even let Lisa help me sort through old clothes and photo albums. She'd hold something up, one of Henry's flannel shirts or Eric's childhood drawings, and say, "You don't need all this clutter, Mom." I'd smile softly and say, "You're right, honey." Then I'd pack what really mattered when she wasn't looking. Small keepsakes, documents, and photographs that no one else would understand the value of. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. What I felt was deeper than anger. It was a kind of clarity that only comes when you've been quiet long enough to really hear your own thoughts. People mistake silence for surrender. But what they don't realize is that silence can be a decision. It's choosing not to waste words on those who aren't listening. It's saving your strength for the moment when it truly counts. I watched them plan and argue, watched them count money that wasn't theirs yet, watched them act like I was already halfway gone. And all the while I was right there, smiling, nodding, pouring tea. By the time they finally called the realtor, the trust papers were already filed, the records sealed, and the property fully secured under my name. They thought I was agreeing, but what I was really doing was protecting what was mine. And when the day came that they realized what I'd done, that the house they'd tried to sell didn't legally belong to them, well, that would be the day they finally learned what Henry always knew. Silence isn't weakness. It's the space where strength learns how to breathe. And I had been holding my breath for far too long. They moved fast, faster than I thought they would. Maybe I should have expected it. Once the idea of money gets into people's heads, common sense tends to leave the room. One afternoon, Lisa called me, bright and businesslike, telling me she'd spoken to a developer interested in the property. Her voice sounded like someone reading from a script. "They want to build a small subdivision," she said. "They'll pay a premium for lots in this area, honestly, Mom. It's a great offer. We should take it." I kept my voice steady. "You think so?" "Yes," she said. "We can split the proceeds. You could get something smaller and easier to manage. You wouldn't have to worry about the upkeep." She made it sound like she was doing me a favor. Paul was all in. "Finally," he said at dinner that night, tapping his fork like a drumstick. "We'll be set. I can fix my credit, maybe start over. It's a fresh start for all of us." Eric's face was unreadable. He kept his fork in his hand, then set it down without eating. "We need to be careful," he warned softly. "This kind of project moves fast. Appraisals, contracts, contingencies. We should consult with Mr. Green." They were already dreaming of what they'd spend, assigning numbers in the air like they were counting chickens. It made my stomach ache, not from hunger, but from how casually they treated the thing that had been our life. The house had shelter and memory, and Henry's initials carved under the deck. To them, it was a balance sheet. They called a realtor. The realtor was a young man in a crisp suit who smiled too wide and talked too quickly. He measured rooms and walked the yard with a clipboard, talking about curb appeal and lot division. He took photos of the house from every angle, like he was cataloging a prize. Lisa listened, leaning forward, eyes bright. Paul whispered numbers in his ear. Eric kept his distance. I made the tea and set out cookies the way I always did when company came. It felt a little absurd playing hostess while people sized up my life. I poured cups and laughed at the realtor's jokes, because that's what you do when something you love is being appraised. You try to make the moment polite and small. Contracts were drawn. An offer was made. The realtor told them it was a solid deal, contingent on title checks and surveys. "We can close in 60 days, he promised. Quick, clean, no fuss." They all looked relieved. They imagined checks, signatures, possibilities. They imagined me choosing a cozy condo with the lights turned down, visiting on holidays. They imagined their lives smoothing out like a creased shirt. I signed the paperwork they brought me, the ones that were ceremonial, the ones that made me feel like everyone was including me. I watched them hand papers back and forth, watchful and satisfied. I said almost nothing. I poured another cup of tea and smiled. Then the developer's attorney called for the title search. "That's what you do," they told me. "Check the records, make sure everything is clear." I didn't think anything would come of it. After all, we're the kids' joint owners. It should have been straightforward, but it wasn't. One morning, Mr. Green called me before anyone else. His voice was careful, measured like someone ringing a bell in a quiet room. "Margaret," he said, "we've had an inquiry regarding the property." "Yes?" I kept my tone calm. "There's been a title issue discovered in the search. The land itself appears to be held in a trust that lists you as sole trustee and beneficiary." I closed my eyes. I'd already known that, but hearing it from someone else made it feel official and immovable. And, he continued, "that means without your signature or direct consent on the trust documents, no sale of the underlying land can legally be completed." It was a small sentence, legally precise, and when it hit the others, it landed like a cold slap. They called me in a flurry. Lisa's voice was sharp, mortified. "What does that mean, Mom? You said you didn't want to make a fuss." Paul was louder. "You can't just hide this from us. You gave us joint ownership. We have the right to." Eric was quiet, voice small. Did he mean for this? Did he tell you?" "He did tell me once," I admitted. "A long time ago. He said it might be needed. He said it would keep the home in the family." "Oh," Lisa said, softer now. "So you've been sitting on this." I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. They saw me differently in that moment, not as the slow, agreeable mother they could manage, but as someone who could act out of foresight. They smelled a barricade where they'd intended a door. The developer's team backed away. "If the land can't be conveyed, we don't have interest in buying the structure alone," their attorney said, polite and final. Lisa pressed for a workaround. "We'll negotiate with the trust," she demanded. "There has to be a way." The trust was airtight. Henry had done things the old way, with careful signatures and legalese that left no cracks. He'd loved me enough to plan for the future in a way none of them had expected, and when the realization sank in, the room that had been full of plans and excitement folded into chaos. They began to argue publicly and loudly for the first time in front of the realtor and the attorney. Money changes how people speak to one another. Paul accused Lisa of greed. Lisa accused Paul of being irresponsible. Eric accused them both of being blind to what mattered. Names were raised, old grudges polished and used like knives. The picture of family unity they'd talked about in whispers fell apart into a messy display no one could have been proud of. Through it all, I sat at the kitchen table, making the tea and listening. I watched the lines crease on Lisa's forehead as she realized the sale wouldn't be easy. I watched Paul's bravado collapse into petulant silence. I watched Eric's hands shake just barely, like he wanted to steady himself with action, but didn't know which way to move. I watched my life, the very place that had sheltered laughter and sorrow and sick nights, be stripped down to a transaction in their minds, and it hurt. But I did not stand up and scream. I did not slam the doors. I let the sound of their voices become the weather that passed over me. When the developer withdrew, there was a kind of stunned hush. Their plans evaporated, replaced by accusations aimed at each other. Lisa blamed Paul for not being assertive enough. Paul blamed Lisa for scheming. Eric blamed both, and himself for not insisting they honor what had been built. Fingers were pointed and doors were shut. It was almost comic if it hadn't been so sad. News travels fast in small towns. Within a week, neighbors who'd once offered casseroles were calling with questions and thinly veiled curiosity. "Did you hear?" some asked. "They almost sold the Hill place." People like to be on the side of the winner. They like to whisper about family dramas the same way they like to water their azaleas, with careful distance. I could have sat in the center of that storm and flung words like thunderbolts. I could have demanded answers, forced confrontations, set the record straight. I could have played their game, but I had watched the damage anger does for a lifetime. I had seen how words can become wedges. I had raised these children, yes, but I had also seen them as they were, flawed, human, and painfully predictable, when money stepped into the room. So instead, I packed a bag, not in haste, not like a woman fleeing, but like a person who had decided to follow a plan she had held in her heart for years. Henry had talked in better days about a small cottage by the sea, a place where we could have retired together, watching gulls and the tide. We never made it there. Life had other plans. But the dream had stayed with me, tucked into the corners like a favorite quilt. I sold less than people expected, a few trinkets, some furniture I no longer needed, a few boxes of old clothes. I mailed letters to distant relatives and left the bigger things where they were. For now, I did not stage any dramatic announcement. I left early one morning with the car packed, the keys on the passenger seat. I slipped a note under the breakfast plate. "Gone for a while. Don't worry about me." They called. Lisa left a voicemail thick with frustration. Paul texted a string of emojis and a "call me." Eric sent a short message asking if I was okay. I didn't answer right away. My heart felt uncluttered in a way it hadn't in decades, as if letting go had created space I hadn't known I needed. The drive to the coast was long but gentle. The highway ribboned the landscape, magnolia and oak blurring past. I thought about Henry, how he would have hummed under his breath along this route. I thought about the kitchen table where so many plans had been made and unmade. I felt something small and firm take root in my chest, a quiet certainty. The cottage was exactly what he'd described, modest, with peeling shutters and a porch that leaned toward the sea like it wanted to listen. A narrow path of salt-kissed grass led down to the dunes. Inside, the floors creaked in time with the waves. Light poured through the windows, making the dust in the air look like little planets. I set my bag down and walked out onto the porch. The ocean breathed in and out, and I felt my shoulders lower for the first time in a long time. I planted myself in a chair, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and watched the horizon. I made tea the same way I always would, and I let the sound of the water be my companion. For a while I did nothing but breathe. In the days that followed, the calls came in fits and starts. At first they were terse. Then they grew more urgent. "We need to talk," Lisa demanded. "We need to sort the paperwork." Paul sent a string of apologetic, then angry, then pleading messages. Eric called once and left a voicemail that made me ache. His voice trembled with a new humility. I listened to them. I replied once or twice, short and practical, arranging a time to meet if needed. Mostly I did not answer. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted to see what would happen when I stopped being the thing they could pin their problems to. Would they learn? Would they bicker until the world they wanted to build collapsed on itself? Would they come to understand the cost of their choices? From my little porch I could almost imagine the storm. The shouting, the lawyers, the grief, the chaos that swirled when people's priorities shifted suddenly from affection to assets. But here the air smelled of salt and thyme. I planted some herbs in a battered pot and felt the soil in my fingers. I wrote Henry a letter and left it in the top drawer of his desk. I walked the dunes and collected shells, each one a small, smooth thing to remind me that the world keeps making beautiful things, even after it takes away the ones we've built. I didn't know if they would finally notice what they lost the way I had. I didn't know if walking away would teach them anything at all. But I knew this. The calm I felt sitting here, my feet planted in sand, watching the tide come in and out, was harder to come by than any check or contract they'd chase. And so I stayed quiet, watching the sky change colors, letting peace become my quiet answer. The days by the ocean began to slip by like soft brushstrokes, slow, quiet, and beautiful in their own way. Time didn't feel heavy here. It didn't ask for explanations or forgiveness. It just moved, gentle and steady, like the tide. In the mornings, I'd wake to the sound of the waves brushing against the shore, that low whisper that sounded almost like breathing. I'd make myself a cup of tea and sit on the porch, watching the gulls drift over the water. The sea was always changing, sometimes silver and smooth as glass, sometimes restless and rough, full of whitecaps and wind. I found comfort in that. It reminded me that even the calmest things can hold storms inside them. I started tending a little garden in the patch of sand beside the cottage. The soil wasn't rich, but it was kind enough to give me color, some lavender, a few daisies, and herbs that smelled of home when the sun hit them. I'd talk to the plants while I worked, the same way I used to talk to Henry. Maybe it sounds silly, but I always felt like he was there, listening quietly, the way he always did. I wrote to him too, letters on thin paper that I never mailed. I kept them in a box by my bed. Sometimes they were long and full of stories about the days since I left. Other times, just a few lines. "The sea looks like your eyes today," or "I finally slept through the night." Writing to him made the house feel less empty, and the silence less lonely. Some nights I'd walk down to the water barefoot. The sand would still be warm from the day, and the moonlight would paint the waves silver. I'd close my eyes and listen, to the ocean, to my heartbeat, to the quiet that no longer frightened me. For years I thought silence meant being forgotten, but now I understood. Silence could mean peace. It could mean finally hearing yourself think, without someone else's voice drowning you out. It took months before I felt completely at ease in this new rhythm. For the first time in my life, there were no schedules, no obligations, no one to manage or soothe. I didn't have to be anyone's rock anymore. And you know what? The world didn't fall apart. The kids didn't crumble without me. They just had to stand on their own, something I should have let them do a long time ago. And first the calls came every few days. Lisa would leave long voicemails, her voice soft at first, then sharp, then soft again. "Mom, I don't understand why you left like that," she said once. "You could have told us. We were just trying to help." Paul's messages came in bursts, quick, emotional, always circling around guilt. "I screwed up, Mom. I know I did. But can we just talk? I'm sorry." And Eric, sweet Eric, his messages were the hardest to hear. "Mom, I don't blame you for anything. I just miss you. Call when you're ready." I didn't ignore them out of spite. I just needed the quiet. I needed to know what life felt like without everyone else's weight pressing on me. For so many years I'd been their anchor. Steady, unshakable, always there. But anchors don't float. They sink. I wanted to float for once. So I took my time. I'd listen to their messages, then step outside and breathe in the salt air. The gulls would circle overhead, and the sound of the waves would wash away whatever guilt tried to creep back in. I realized something out there by the sea. Forgiveness doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's enough just to stop carrying the hurt. The world around me began to grow again, in small ways. I got to know the people in town, the grocer, the woman who sold handmade soaps, the old fisherman who brought in his catch before dawn. They didn't know my story, and I liked it that way. Here I wasn't Mom or Mrs. Hill. I was just Margaret, a woman who smiled at the sea and always bought too many lemons. Sometimes people would ask, "Don't you ever get lonely?" And I'd smile and say, "No, I had noise for too long. This is peace." One afternoon, in late spring, I'd had a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, Lisa's, neat and deliberate. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note. "We're sorry, Mom, for everything. We didn't see what we were doing until it was too late. The house isn't the same without you. Please come home, or at least tell us where you are." The paper smelled faintly of her perfume. I traced her words with my fingertips, and felt something shift. Not pain, not anger, just tenderness. My children had finally learned the one lesson I couldn't teach them through lectures or sacrifice. They'd learned it through loss. I didn't write back right away. Instead, I took the letter down to the shore. The sky was wide open, painted in gold and pink, and the wind carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. I read the letter one last time, then folded it carefully and placed it in my box with Henry's letters. That night, I lit a small candle on the porch. I sat there with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the flame flicker while the sea breathed in front of me. I thought about all the years I'd spent chasing approval, trying to be enough for everyone but myself. I thought about how tired I'd been, and how much lighter I felt now. Peace isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It comes quietly like a slow sunrise. You don't notice it at first, and then suddenly it's everywhere, warming you from the inside out. I still miss Henry, but now when I think of him, it's not with the ache of loss, it's with gratitude. He gave me love, and he gave me the wisdom to protect myself when the world forgot how to. I think he would have smiled to see me here, tending the lavender and sipping my tea, finally learning that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for others is to stop letting them lean on you until you break. A few weeks later, I did call Eric. His voice cracked when he answered. "Mom, it's me," I said, smiling. "I'm okay." We talked for a long time about nothing and everything. The weather, his new job, the sound of the waves in the background. He didn't ask where I was, and I didn't offer. There was understanding in the silence between us, a kind that doesn't need words. After we hung up, I walked outside again. The tide was low, the sand cool under my feet. I watched the water glimmer in the moonlight and felt the breeze lift my hair. For so long I thought revenge had to be loud, that justice meant confrontation. But standing there barefoot and free, I finally understood. Revenge doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it just means walking away and finding peace they can't touch. That was my quiet justice. Not a slammed door, not a sharp word, just the sound of waves and the freedom to breathe without asking permission. Now, when people ask about my life, I smile and tell them I live by the sea. They don't need to know the rest. The house, the arguments, the will, the lessons, those belong to the past. This part of my story belongs to me, and every evening as the sun dips low and the sky turns to fire, I whisper to Henry's memory, "You were right, my love. They did learn, and I finally did too." Then I pour myself a cup of tea, sit on the porch, and let the ocean tell its endless story, calm, steady, and full of secrets. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't in what you say or what you take back. It's in the peace you keep for yourself. And if my story has taught you anything, if it's reached some quiet part of you that's still holding too much, then remember this. You don't always have to fight to win. Sometimes you just have to walk away and start again. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Maybe someone else needs the reminder that peace can be its own kind of justice. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to follow along. There are so many quiet battles worth telling, and even more victories found in silence.